Well, hello everybody. We're going to talk about global city networks and to discuss whether they can really drive transformation. Everybody knows that networks are flavour of the month, or have been for a while, and they talk about them. And I've got here with me the director of the BMW Herbert Quandt Foundation, and we're going to have a bit of a chat about that. But first of all, he's going to talk about the RISE program that they've developed. RISE means resilience, intelligence, sustainability, and equalities. Frank, please tell me a bit about that RISE program. That would be great.
Charles, good morning, and happy to be with you. And probably as usually, there's a little bit. I'm a little bit sad that we can't attend physically, but I'm enjoying to be part of it, at least virtually. You asked me about the RISE City program. For me, cities are a very important area, as all you know, in intensifying the challenges we are facing on the world. And on the other hand, it's also a topic where a tremendous amount of people are already deep into it. There are a lot of interesting projects. And having said that, we were like, how can we contribute a new element on that? And our answer was responsible leadership. And the reason why I'm coming from that is that's the mission of our foundation. And the key part of that is that we see a lot of positive impulses when people are building communities in a different way, in a more collaborative way, in a more open way. And as a result, we have, based on our mission, created the RISE city concept. RISE is abbreviation for resilience, intelligent, sustainable, and equitable city. And the main idea is not focusing only on content topics, but bringing important stakeholders together. And those important stakeholders in our program for us are mainly, of course, the citizen, governmental authorities or administration of cities, and the third pillar, startup world, in order to create solutions. And we are really looking forward to moving from a more discussion side really to the enabling and solution building side.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. That's a lovely description. Just so everybody knows how this is going to unfold, firstly, we're going to see 3 videos from very important global networks. Then Frank's going to come back, and then we're going to be joined by Edgar Pieterse from the African Centre for Cities, and then we'll all have a discussion. But just to give you a bit of an indication of what the videos are about, firstly, we're going to hear from C40. Many of you know that, which is a connection of the major cities around the world, and who are trying to take really bold climate change initiatives. And we'll be hearing from David Miller, who was formerly a really successful mayor of Toronto. And I love the fact, or I don't love the fact, that he did this on his mobile, because as he was doing our recording, the computer crashed. But anyway, that's a great snapshot you'll hear from him. Then we have Wolfgang Teubner, who's head of Eclair Europe. Again, many of you know them. They were one of the first truly global networks addressing environmental concerns. And lastly, we're going to hear from Anna-Lisa Boni, who's sort of partly locked down somewhere in Italy, and she runs Eurocities, the biggest of its kind in Europe. Really, literally more than 100 cities are involved in that. So I think off we go, and let's look at these videos, which will follow each other in sequence.
Hello, my name is David Miller. I'm the Director of International Diplomacy at C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and the former Mayor of Toronto, Canada. First of all, I do want to thank all of the public servants who are participating in the Creative Bureaucracy event. Really appreciate being invited, and I know from my very long public service myself how incredibly important and what a difference creative thinking applied to public problems can produce. C40 Cities is an example of that. We were founded by London Mayor Ken Livingstone in 2005 with the idea that the voices and the actions of the mayors of the world's greatest cities could make a very real difference to climate change. And since then, the organization has been doing exactly that. It's a mayor-to-mayor organization with extremely strong staff of talented and committed professionals. To give you some sense of what we do, after the Paris Accord in 2015, C40 took very seriously the 1.5 degree trajectory. And our mayors committed at our next conference in Mexico City to a program we called Deadline 2020, which committed each of their cities to producing a climate plan as part of a 1.5 degree trajectory for the world. So each city was committing to do its share by essentially halving emissions by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050. And I'm very proud to say that over 80 C40 cities and over 30 non-C40 cities have today developed such plans or in the process of developing them. And over 50 C40 cities by the end of this year will have peaked emissions. Compare that to the actions of national governments, and I think it speaks very much to the importance of cities. Another example, 2010, 10 years ago, there were less than 100 electric buses in the fleets of cities. By working together as mayors with the support of C40, there are now over 66,000 electric buses on the streets of city across the world, and many more to come, dramatically helping to lower emissions from the transportation sector. This year, in response to the COVID challenges that the world is facing, but particularly felt in our urban areas, C40 mayors formed a task force on a just and green recovery, led by the mayor of Milan, Mayor Giuseppe Sala. This task force has reported out not just on actions that cities are taking, which are significant, including repurposing roads for people and cycling, including supporting safe mass transit, including addressing equity implications of COVID and health and safety, including affordable housing, as done in Lisbon with a very interesting program, but also advice to national governments on how to secure a just and green recovery from COVID, starting by ending fossil fuel subsidies and using that money to support a green transition that creates jobs for all. C40 leadership hasn't stopped there. Under the leadership of Mayor Eric Garcetti, we're thinking very strongly about how we can build the necessary coalition to the next Conference of the Parties in Glasgow in 2021 to ensure that effectively it can become the last COP. And we know at C40 that the actions of our major cities speak incredibly loudly and provide the mayors a platform to advocate for the inclusion of others. We also know that by building broad coalitions, including business, national governments, civil society, youth, labor unions, and others, we really can make dramatic progress on climate change. In our cities, we see greenhouse gas emissions predominantly coming from 4 areas: how we heat and cool buildings, from transportation, from how we manage our waste, and from how we generate electricity. And it's our goal over the next 15 months to build a global Green New Deal coalition to help address dramatic climate action in each of those areas. And the question I have for everyone here is, what's your part? How do we build a coalition to effectively make the COP in Glasgow the last one we need? Because the actions coming out of that COP are equal to the ambitions of these leading mayors. How do we ensure that our existing buildings and our new buildings get at or close to zero carbon? How do we ensure a zero carbon energy grid? How do we ensure zero carbon transportation? How do we ensure a circular economy that really dramatically lowers the amount of waste that's produced? These are complex questions. They require a broad coalition. And at their heart, they require really creative solutions from a creative bureaucracy. That's our question for you. And we look forward to collaborating over the next 15 months to solve this really serious challenge.
Eclair was founded by local governments to be the local voice in the international sustainable development process. It was founded in 1992 as a response to the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio. Eclair organizes the local government input into these processes, as well as supports the implementation of the agreements on the local level. In particular, this is for the United Nations Convention on Climate Change and all the following agreements up to the Paris Agreement reached in 2015, the Convention on Biodiversity, and of course the Agenda 21, and also the following on process that are today comprised in the Sustainable Development Goals. Particularly, of course, Sustainable Development Goal 11 relating to urban development. What have we achieved until today? The first, one of the very important successes was to draft and anchor Chapter 28 in the Agenda 21 that is known as the Local Agenda 21. Through that, we have managed to generate and motivate thousands of local Agenda 21 planning processes around the world that also resulted in the standard of participatory planning, which is applied very widely today around the world in local governments and for local development planning. We have also managed to raise the status and involvement of local governments in the processes to further the global agreements that is also documented today in the Paris 2015 Climate Agreement, as well as in the SDG 11 relating to urban development. What are we still missing, or where are our dilemmas? I think today, we have worked by and large to change processes within the system. But what we need in order to achieve the Global Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, is we need a systemic change. So we need not changes within the current system, but we need the change of the system, which is of course a lot more challenging. And to that end, I think we also need very active civil society. We have to go beyond participatory planning. We have even to go beyond participatory or create co-creation in the development of our cities. I think we need co-implementation. So we need the civil society to take these goals and agreements on board and to work with their local governments to achieve sustainable development locally. And we are absolutely convinced that the goals that we need to achieve can only be achieved with a strong involvement of the local level, because only there the community can be activated and become an active part in the implementation.
Europe is like a big city, a place for all to live and work, move and meet, and enjoy life. Most of our people live in cities. They produce most of our economic output and also most of our emissions. That's why the future of Europe will be decided in cities. Yes, our world and our way of life are fragile. Good that our network of European cities is working for a better future for all in the city of tomorrow. Together, we are shaping the urban future.
Yeah, this film is the first product with Eurocities' new logo and design, and we've just launched both of them in September. And why a new look? Because the world around us is changing, and so are we. It's been like this from the beginning of Eurocities 34 years ago, so a journey of constant change. 6 cities came together in 1986 to make their voices heard in the European Union, by the European Union. So the EU is an organization of member states, not of cities, but 75% of our people live in cities. They stand for 85% of our economy. And climate change, social inclusion, integration of migrants, all these important things are done and need to be done in cities. And that's why cities need a greater say in European policy, how we say they have to have a seat at the table. And that's why Eurocities was founded. We've been growing into a network of almost 200 cities, 145 big cities with more than 250,000 inhabitants, and 53 smaller partner cities. And all together, we represent more than 130 million people from 39 countries. Because actually, our Europe is bigger than the EU. And we have established expertise and working, activities in areas like environment, economy, culture, social affairs, mobility, and digitalization. We've helped to put cities on the European map and give them visibility and a voice in Brussels. In the last 3 decades, thanks to our work, cities are much more at the center of European policy, I would say, and funding. And even if there is still a big need for a coordinated urban vision in the EU, we are proud for what we have achieved. And just before the summer, our mayors met with many EU commissioners and offered a new pact, a new alliance, of cities with the EU to tackle the challenges of the corona pandemic and its consequences. Our work usually involves lots of meetings where city officers and politicians exchange and work together. During the pandemic, we put our collaboration online, like many other people. With the digital platform COVID News, where cities share best practices and challenges, this has become a key resource for cities and the EU institutions on COVID-19. And we created new video meetings formats, for instance, like we call them city dialogues. And, through them, we exchange and we organize mutual learning. COVID-19 has hit cities the hardest. And in the aftermath of the pandemic, the very concept of the city is challenged. When teleworking becomes the new normal, suburbs and the countryside, where life is more affordable and healthier, could be the winners. When restaurants, shops, offices are closing, well, the city loses some of its revenues. When culture and entertainment, food and tourism are threatened, well, the attractiveness of the city can be at risk. Well, is this the death of the city, as some prophets already predict? Or, what can city leaders do to set a new course? How can we reinvent and reshape the city? Eurocities is connecting cities to support the transformation and the systemic changes that we need. We help city governments to become better, more innovative, more creative, closer to people. And we can do it as a network. Together we are stronger, and together we are more creative.
Well, that was very helpful, and thank you, those 3 speakers. That was wonderful. And I'm now joined, or we are joined rather, by Edgar Pieterse from Cape Town, and I'd love him to give a bit of an African perspective on networks and what's different or what's the same. So, Edgar, over to you. Hello.
Hi, Charles, and thanks for having me part of this process. This is, of course, an adjustment to operate in this multi-dimensional format, but I'll try and keep my wits about me. So I think it is important to, of course, broaden the conversation beyond the European context, as we've heard, and I would imagine the OECD frameworks, because we do face very different challenges on the African continent. By virtue of context, it's maybe worthwhile to remind the audience that Africa is a latecomer with the urbanization process. We only 43% urbanized on the continent. That translates to more than Europe, but about 480 million people in cities and towns. But the big issue is that in just the next 25 years, that number will double or more than double to 1.2 billion people. And the challenge we confront is that as we speak today, about 60% of these urban populations, they survive the city, if you will, on their own wits. They don't have access to basic services. They don't have access to formal jobs. And the promise of the city or the promise of urbanization is not quite available to them for a whole bunch of complicated political economy reasons. Now, the issue is in that context, what is the role of networks and how do we think about it? The first issue to recognize is that a lot of African governments are struggling to get their heads around the significance and the potentialities of urbanization. The reflex action is urbanization is bad, so how do we stem it? And how do we prevent migration from rural to urban areas? But it also means that often they fail to invest adequately in urban infrastructure and services to deal with what one could call slum urbanism. Now, at the African Center for Cities, where I'm based, we've worked the last 12 years to grow two networks in particular. The one is called the Association of African Planning Schools. And the idea is that the way urban professionals and practitioners are trained, that holds the key to be able to usher in a new generation of urban governance, planning, and management. And so what we've done is to really fundamentally question the inherited planning regimes and paradigms. And we are trying through a peer learning process and an open knowledge platform to generate a new set of methodologies and tools about what kind of planning and regulation makes sense in the African context. The second network is called the African Urban Research Initiative, or short AURI. And there what we realized is that, as we've heard from the other speakers, the action lies at the local level. You need endogenous solutions that is responsive to the local context. However, if you have a disconnect between your political process, your planning processes, private sector investment, and what communities or civil society are doing, you of course compound the problem. And what we realized is that we needed to work with fellow academics, researchers, urban facilitators, if you will, and build a paradigm around co-production, similar to the kind of approach that Frank was speaking about in the opening remarks. And what we've done is we've built this network now of 21 institutions across the continent that are all experimenting with what co-production of relevant and useful urban knowledge might look like, and how can that get our cities onto a more sustainable trajectory. Now, within this, there are a number of challenges. The first is, because of the scale of Africa and the relative deficit in resources and funding for African universities and civil society groups, it is extremely expensive to operate and run these networks. Secondly, we also find that there's a real generational issue that often you find in these different nodal organizations or universities, senior faculty that act as gatekeepers and see networks as a form of social capital, if you will, and that they can be the brokers. And I think thinking through the power inequalities within these networks and how they operate is an important issue. But the third issue is a bit more complex, and this is the political economy in these different areas. And how does one create a level playing field where you have actors with very, very differential power trying to be brought together to figure out what are solutions and innovations? So I think it is important to talk about creativity, innovation, but we should also do a reality check and understand that power gets reinscribed. And so how do we think of networks that are both open, that are inclusive, but also can ask the hard questions, can deal with the difficult issues of who's included and who's excluded? And maybe just to leave you with one example, the biggest investment in many African cities are these gated new town developments, which are on the surface green, or they embody some green architectural standards, But in the aggregate, they worsen inequalities in these cities. But of course, they are able to get the politicians and powerful political interests to support them. So how do we think of networks in relation to these trends that are clearly inequitous, that is worsening the carbon footprint of these cities, and is reinforcing pre-existing conditions in terms of poverty and inequality? So I want to, I guess, leave with that provocation, and then I look forward to the conversation and the discussion. Thank you, Charles.
Yes, thank you very much, Edgar. Now, Frank, you've listened to quite a lot there. Have you got any initial feelings or responses to what you've heard? Could you tell me something about that, please?
Yes, Charles. I'd love to. And actually, let's take on what Edgar was saying. At the end, creating networks which work differently, for me, is a crucial element. Perhaps I'd like to come back for a second to the BMW Foundation's work, because I didn't mention it that extensively at the beginning. Our mission, Inspiring Responsible Leadership, is mainly based on network activities. So we have almost 2,000 members on a worldwide network from all different sectors. We're not only focused on cities, but of course, cities is also a topic within the network. And what we have experienced, that before starting any activity or trying to find solutions, you need a mental and emotional base within the network. Having this networks is a prerequisite for any cooperation, for any collaboration. And honestly speaking, one of key element which Edgar mentioned also, but also the other speakers, is probably you are working with stakeholders with different languages, with a different framework, with different settings, and bringing those together is, for me, one of the most challenging points. And that's again why I think in your progress, and that's also why I like the creative side of the bureaucracy, as you mentioned it in your festival. It's a key element to really come to a new frontier at that end, because I think rational discussions are led for long term, and we must honest too. The whole discussion about changing the system, changing to a more sustainable world, is not a win-win situation. People will have to give up their assets. You need new compromises. You will need new balances, and I don't believe that this would be possible without a basic understanding and a basic mutual understanding within those networks. For us, the key element is, and that's why we call our activities the responsible leadership. We believe in leaders. We believe that the individual person is the key to drive change. And leaders, in addition, if they are acting in a responsible way, and this is true for a mayor, that can be true for citizen organizations or solution builders, if they have a broader perspective and they can use their lever due to their role, then things are moving forward. And I think, coming back to that, there is no one single solution. I think there are big global technologies which will enable us to lead a project and a process differently. However, the solutions will be found more, in my opinion, on the local side, and by that will be very different from one place to another.
Edgar, can I bring you in again there, and perhaps you could respond, because there were a couple of issues I really found interesting there. The question of cultural specificity, you know, that issue is a massive one, so that I'll just leave that one there. And then the other thing that it just reminds me of, all of the work of all these people we've heard, including you, Frank, and so on, is hard work. And a friend of mine always says network has two parts of a word: net, connecting, and work. Some things may happen on their own, but it really is complicated. Is it going to be done from above? Who's running the work? How does that function? Perhaps you can just respond a bit to those types of issues, Edgar. That would be great.
Yeah, no, thanks, Charles. So on the first point of cultural specificity and listening to Frank, so of course I'm absolutely delighted to hear that there's an acknowledgement that this idea that there's somehow a win-win solution out there is a fallacy, that given the extent to which the current system is dysfunctional and systemically driving the problems that we face, and the need for a radical alternative, that transition is going to be painful. And of course, we need to be able to build a language and, if you will, a set of reference points about how to name that, how to package it, and what are the ways in which one manages through that. And I think if we can connect the idea of leadership with a term that we have developed in our work and our processes of system integrators, I think we're getting to something that captures both the need for helping the various actors involved in the process to understand what is going on, to make sense of it, to connect the individual transformations that's required, and how that requires organizational and institutional reforms as well. And that's a constant negotiation and so on. And a lot of the specificity that you're talking about, Charles, is precisely to develop the skill set to do that kind of reading and translation. And so I couldn't agree more with this idea of leadership as critical to the notion of effective localization or understanding cultural specificity. On the question of hard work, absolutely. So I think that there is a complete misunderstanding that networks are somehow glamorous work. I think it can't be further from the truth. Usually networks, in the ideal, they are distributed. They've got multiple nodes and they operate fairly autonomously across these nodes, but they are able to aggregate conversations, insight, learning, and impact. However, when one is starting up or nurturing a network to maturity, for that first period, you have people who've got to be at the center, if you will, of the network, who've got to hold the different strands together and do all of the hard work of translating across difference, of sense making, setting strategic direction, and helping people come to terms with the difference between their expectations and, if you will, the kind of process nature of networking activity. And that is a pretty thankless task because it takes an enormous amount of time and transaction cost. And it is very difficult to see short-term results. You're doing an investment into a new organizational institutional culture that is future-oriented. So I think it is important to demystify this, but also not to say that there aren't networks that are so well resourced that often they run the risk of just existing for their own sake and not really assessing whether they're making an impact or not. And so one has got to navigate between these two extremes. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Back to you, Frank. I mean, one of the questions that you've obviously addressed many times is, there are different types of networks. Some share things at a more shallow level. I'm not saying shallow in a negative sense, but, here's a bit of information and so on. And others try to really get together, co-learn, perhaps obviously ideally see each other and so on. Do you mind responding a bit to that point? Because there are different forms of decision making and different approaches to different networks.
Absolutely, and I think and happy that Edgar here shares the same experience than we make. If people think about networks, often there's like, who is in there, what's your alumni, and so on. And actually, that's not at all the way we are thinking. For us, as I mentioned again, the key element is first to have people in the network independently of their organization. So we do not invite organizations into our network, but a person which is in the role of a certain organization. And the person would stay within the network, even if it's changing job. And the reason behind is really that the connection is the important element, especially as Edgar said, you won't see any short-term impact. It's much more about crafting a foundation for a longer collaboration and a longer perspective. Secondly, another interesting, you can say, metrics for us is also how much is the network working itself. So what activity is going in the network without our spark, with our energy. And that's what we see tremendously, that once you have connected a certain type of people we are looking for, there is activity and energy within the network independently of us. And that's a very crucial element, having in mind that you need people for a long run and not for a short-term change. Change him system, change him into a completely new setting really needs creativity, but also, as you're coming back to the example of hard work, needs the energy to keep on the topic. And there's a third element which is very important to me. I mentioned that I think you are talking to people and stakeholder group with different frameworks and different setting. But there's also an important element, a city building on infrastructure, building on new society systems is a really complex and envisioning area. So networks, and I think even collaboration between different networks is crucial to enable people to think ahead. If I would ask you, I would like to, in which kind of city you would love, probably you are an expert and you have an idea, but normally no one can assess a future 10, 15 years from now and giving an answer. So if you really want to craft a future, of city, to craft a different system, there is a lot on work to do on the methods, on the decision-making process and the creation process in order really to make progress on that. And that's something probably in the past had been done mostly from top-down organization, big players, which at the end then led perhaps to a global perspective, but not the right solution on the local basis.
Just before I come back to you, Edgar, you don't give any the people who are called responsible leaders any prizes or anything like that. How do you make them excited to be part of this thing that you have and you're trying to put together, Frank?
That's an interesting question. Honestly speaking, it's the most difficult to explain once you haven't experienced it. We start with this element of inspiring responsible leadership, and the elements are mostly formats where people meet for a couple of days and exchange their personal journey. And the key element for the network is there a common attitude towards changing the world towards a sustainable approach, wherever area you come from. So in this networks is really the cross-sectoral approach is the key element. We have, of course, city planners into it. We had governmental people, but also artists, scientists, and creative people. And the mixture and the openness to cooperate, to collaborate, to communicate with other is the basic assessment at the really first encounters. And at the end, we invite people where we think they are open for such a process, and that's perhaps not a very metrics assessment process, but someone we have made a lot of experience, and in the end it's a bonding within the networks rather than awarding prizes or celebrating people's activity. It's really an intrinsic motivation you find within those people.
Yeah, good phrase, intrinsic motivation. Edgar, any responses to what Frank's been talking about just now?
Yeah, no, it sounds like a really carefully thought through and crucial approach. And, you know, it would be fantastic to learn more about that and see how one can get more African urban leaders involved and engaged. What strikes me, though, is that from our experience, when you create these opportunities through these network platforms for leaders to come together and, if you will, learn new things, provide mutual support to each other, at the core of that is a space to talk about their own struggles back in their home city, in their hometown. And what you find typically of these people is that they tend to have their own local networks that they curate themselves, where they bring together people from different sectors. So they may not call them formally networks, but they have a direct leadership role and an experience of the complexity of bringing difference together in order to build shared understanding and common purpose. And I think the extent to which one can tap those experiences and the intrinsic assessments of one's own skill set, capacities, weaknesses, and so forth, and translate them when people come together in these forums, I think that's really the key to success. And so I'm really, sort of fascinated by what Frank has explained, and would personally love to understand more of that. The second point I wanted to make is this idea of the scale of the complexity. And the importance of when people are brought together in this format to lead and support networks, it's important that they are both allowed to demonstrate their capacities and skills, but also, if you will, to be exposed to the non-rational, the aesthetic, the artistic sides, which of course reminds one that there are multiple forms of knowledge that is required when one is dealing with complex system challenges. And again, thinking through that and how one can take networks to the next generation, that they are both purposeful, but they are also a context within which one can nurture a new generation of leaders. It has to always return back to this question: how do you bring the capacity for different disciplines, different perspectives, different scales to be read together in relation to specific challenges in specific places, and thinking futurally about that. So yeah, so just very inspired by what I've heard so far. Thanks.
Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes left of our conversation, and I just wanted to highlight two issues. I mean, obviously there's the digitizing world we are increasingly in, and to some extent there is this issue of how one makes these experience of being in a network more felt. I don't want to use the overused word immersive, but there's a version of that. And secondly, the final question perhaps related, is we're struggling to explore perhaps the next iteration, or not iteration, but development of what a network might be. Could you both, sort of as a final thing, address these two questions each? Perhaps starting with you, Frank.
I think there was one important sentence on Edgar's element, and which is the key from our process. Often when we are talking about our work on a network, we are rather talking about community building, and that's a big difference, because at the end it's a lot of investment. I'm not talking about a monetary investment, but in people investment, to have an understanding about a community which is mostly local, but how this community then can be connected to world community. And that's one of our biggest challenge, for two reasons. One is to explain it from a more central point, and being still a small organization as a foundation, how you can have the resources and the connections on a global base really to do this. And second, as I mentioned, we believe in leadership and leaders as a multiplier for that, and that what is requested are local leaders. Edgar, we have some leaders in both Cape Town and Johannesburg where we're working with. I had been personally also on, as we call it, global tables down and working together with those. And the key point is how to find them and how to exactly strengthen their local work, but strengthen mostly their personal journey by, for instance, exchanging with experience with other leaders in different places in the world. And what we're trying to do is really to balance both, to being on the ground in different regions. As I mentioned, the key issue, how to be spread all over with limited resources, but also to connect those experiences with other parts in the world. And sometimes, let's take an example of cities. It's not only about the cities. Sometimes it's about a citizen. I know one big topic in South Africa was, for instance, about integrity. So you had people who had created new elements to prove how integrity in administration and public world is an important element to drive a system differently. And that's it's nothing to do with obviously on sustainability at the beginning, and that's what I meant. It's a huge diversity of approaches, a huge diversity of activities, and for such a network with such a community to have the flexibility to cope with that is the crucial learning. And honestly speaking, it's a long run to get experiences also for us, even
just Edgar, perhaps you could just, because we're just slowly going to move very shortly into the global highlight hour, so perhaps for a couple of minutes you could just wrap up some points and perhaps focusing on the future.
Thank you. Yes, and I'll be to the point. So I think we can't overstate how radical the transformation is if we're serious about sustainable cities going forward. So I think what I envisage is that we've got to really understand that every fabric, from the state to the corporate firm to civil society organizations, institutionally has to be rethought and repurposed. And so how do we imagine innovation milieus at different scales come into being? And that the role of networks, in my view, is that it brings together the leaders who will both offer the vision and the concrete leadership to establish these innovation milieus. And so the question is, how do we think big enough about the extent of these, and so that we can move between the system change, whether it is the mode of production, whether it's technological underpinnings, to individual transitions to be able to operate in a digital environment, in a new economy. And what I've heard in this panel is that we've got some of the existing institutions, local authorities and so forth, really refining in terms of mission, how they're going to get to zero carbon cities, but that we also need other kinds of networks that bring certain types of leaders together that will drive and embed the transformation in these cities. So for me, I see this as a very promising moment where we're getting greater clarity about what the potentialities are. Thank you.
Can I both thank you? Can I thank you both rather than that way? So Frank, thanks for being there and being part of all of this. And Edgar, of course, coming from Cape Town as well. I mean, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you about this, and I hope to see you all very soon. So thank you very much, and perhaps join the Global Highlight Hour in a few minutes. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Charles.
Bye-bye.